All right, get ready for a deep dive into a world where horror goes way too far. We're talking banned horror films. You know, the movie's so disturbing that whole countries decided, nope, not showing that here. Ever wondered what pushes a horror film over that line? Well, that's exactly what we're going to explore today. The why behind the bans.
It's fascinating. Banned films are like a mirror. They reflect the anxieties, the taboos of different cultures. What might be shrugged off in one country could spark outrage in another.
So before we get into specific movies, let's back up a bit. Why do countries ban films? Is it all just about the blood and guts, the gore?
Well, while graphic violence is a factor, it's not the whole story. Bans can be triggered by a whole bunch of stuff deemed offensive or harmful. Think explicit sexual content, disturbing themes that challenge those social norms, or even political messages that clash with the country's whole ideology.
So it's not just about counting the body count in some slasher flick.
No, not at all. It's really about understanding the cultural context. The specific fears and sensitivities a film might tap into.
All right, let's get to the fun stuff, the movies. And we'll start with a category that's pretty straightforward, films that were banned for extreme gore. And I think a good example of this is that Japanese film Grotesque.
Ah, yes, grotesque. Takes torture, horror to the extreme. It's essentially non-stop brutality inflicted on this kidnapped couple. Even the UK, which has a pretty high tolerance for on-screen violence, refused to classify it, meaning it was effectively banned.
Wow, the UK wouldn't even touch it. That's saying something.
And their reasoning was interesting. It wasn't just citing specific acts of violence. They objected to the film's whole concept. They argued that Grotesque lacked any real narrative beyond just the torture, made it particularly objectionable.
So it's not just about how much gore, but also the lack of a deeper meaning.
Exactly. And this sparked a whole debate within Japan about the artistic merit of these so-called splatter films. Where's the line between artistic expression and exploitation? That's a question that we'll keep bumping into as we dig into these banned films.
All right, let's go from pure gore to a film that hit a different nerve. Hostel. I've seen this one. It definitely pushes some boundaries. But a ban. What was it about Hostel that got such a strong reaction?
Well, Hostel plays on a very specific fear. That fear of the unknown, the fear of being a tourist in a strange place where you're vulnerable, you don't speak the language.
Yeah, that whole wrong turn anxiety fuels so many horror films.
But Hostel kind of took it a step further, portraying Europe, this popular tourist destination, as this haven for sadistic torture. Ukraine, especially, took offense, banned both Hostel and Hostel.
Right.
Part 2 cited excessive cruelty and the really negative portrayal of their region.
Makes sense. It's one thing to watch a generic slasher. It's another thing to see your own country portrayed as a hunting ground for tourists.
And it went beyond Ukraine. Politicians in the UK actually called for the film to be banned without even watching it. Just reacting to the outcry and the film's notoriety shows how sometimes bans are driven by preconceptions, not a real assessment of the content.
Talk about judging a book by its cover. So we've talked about gore, cultural anxieties. Now let's get to a film banned for a very specific historical reason. Land of the Dead. This is a zombie flick by the legend George Romero. What could be so controversial about a zombie movie?
Well, Land of the Dead is pretty tame,
Yeah.
especially by today's standards. But it got banned in Ukraine because of concerns about it evoking memories of the Holodomor.
Okay, remind me. The Holodomor was?
The Holodomor was this horrific man-made famine orchestrated by Stalin's regime in Ukraine in the 1930s. Millions died. It's a deeply traumatic chapter in their history.
So how did a zombie movie set in, post-apocalyptic Pennsylvania trigger those anxieties about a historical famine?
The worry was that showing cannibalism in Land of the Dead, it's a common thing in zombie movies, could stir up those memories of starvation and the desperation of the Holodomor.
It does seem like a bit of a stretch, connecting a fictional zombie apocalypse to a real historical tragedy.
Might seem far-fetched to some, but it shows how film can tap into those deep-seated cultural traumas, even unintentionally. Harmless entertainment in one context can carry a completely different weight in another.
That's a powerful reminder how sensitive we need to be when dealing with historical trauma, even in fiction.
And it begs the question we'll keep coming back to, who gets to decide what's too far? Who gets to draw the lines between art, entertainment, and potential harm?
All right, let's switch gears a bit. Let's talk about a film that caused a stir for a totally different reason. The Interview. Now, this is a comedy, not horror, but it landed on that banned list in a big way. Remind us why this Seth Rogen and James Franco flick got into so much trouble.
The Interview. It's a satirical comedy. Revolves around a plot to assassinate the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un. And as you might imagine, North Korea was not laughing.
Yeah, I remember this one making headlines. Didn't North Korea threaten to, like, retaliate against the U.S. if this film was released?
They did. They condemned the film as an act of war, even threatened terrorist attacks on theaters that showed it. Sony Pictures, the studio, faced a massive cyber attack, widely attributed to North Korea.
It was a wild situation. Theaters were backing out of screenings. Sony had this major security breach. What did they end up doing?
Sony decided to release the film online in just a limited number of theaters. It was a box office success, but the controversy was completely unprecedented for a Hollywood comedy.
So even a silly comedy can get banned if it hits those political nerves.
Absolutely. The interviews show that satire, even when it's meant to be just pure entertainment, can have some serious real-world consequences, especially when you're talking about international politics, powerful figures who don't like being made fun of.
All right. Before we get to our next batch of banned films, let's talk about something that had a huge impact on the horror genre in the UK, the video nasty era.
Ah, yes, the video nasties. That was a period in the UK in the 80s when all these low-budget horror films, a lot of them from the US, flooded the home video market. They were known for their graphic violence, disturbing content, and, often that exploitative nature.
I've heard the term, but what exactly made a film a video nasty? Was it all about the gore?
It wasn't just about the blood and guts. These films dealt with taboo subjects, pushed boundaries of taste, and most importantly, they were easy for anyone to get, all ages, thanks to home video.
So it was like a perfect storm of moral panic, graphic content right there in your living room.
Exactly. The media whipped up a frenzy. There was this fear that these films were corrupting young people, contributing to societal decay, led to a crackdown on the home video industry and the creation of this video nasty list, films that were banned or heavily censored.
And this video nasty panic had a lasting effect on horror films.
Oh, absolutely. Stricter censorship laws, a chilling effect on how certain horror films were distributed, and even influenced filmmakers, made them wary of pushing things too far.
So when we talk about banned horror films, especially in the UK, we have to understand this whole video nasty thing. It really shaped what was okay and what was too extreme for viewers.
Precisely. And we'll see this legacy play out in some of the films we're about to discuss.
All right, get ready to dig into the dark heart of the video nasty list as we explore some of the most controversial and disturbing films that were deemed too extreme for British audiences.
We were just talking about the video nasties and how they impacted the UK, but this whole idea of a film being too much, well, it's not just a British thing, it's global.
So even within that video nasty era, some films stood out as particularly shocking.
Absolutely. One that earned a spot on that banned list in the UK and really sparked debate worldwide. I Spit on Your Grave.
Oh yeah, I Spit on Your Grave, I've heard of it. Gotta admit though, I'm not familiar with the details. What made this one so controversial?
Well, the film follows this woman who's brutally assaulted and left for dead. And the first part is incredibly graphic, hard to watch. But the controversy really blew up in the second half. That's when she comes back and takes revenge on her attackers, systematically.
So it's a revenge story, but with really graphic and disturbing violence.
Exactly. And what made it even more controversial was the debate about its message. Some people saw it as, this powerful story, even if extreme, about female empowerment and getting righteous vengeance. But others said it was exploitative, even misogynistic, that it reveled in the very violence it was supposed to be condemning.
It sounds like a film that just forces you to confront some really uncomfortable truths about violence and gender and revenge. No wonder it got such a strong reaction.
And it wasn't just the UK grappling with I Spit on Your Grave. It was banned or cut up in tons of countries. It's still a film that provokes discussion and debate, even today.
Okay, let's go from a film rooted in, sadly, a pretty common kind of violence to one that explores a much darker, more surreal kind of horror. Salò, or the 120 Days of Sodom.
Ah, Salò. This one really pushes the limits. Based on the Marquis de Sade's infamous novel, it shows the systematic abuse and torture of a group of teenagers by, well, let's just say, fascist libertines.
Yeah, I've heard whispers about this one. Honestly, the title alone makes me curious and a little apprehensive. What makes it so disturbing? Is it just the violence, or is there something more?
It's definitely about more than just physical violence. Salò digs into those dark corners of human nature, exploring power, corruption, and the total dehumanization of people. It's meant to provoke, to challenge the viewer, forces you to face your own limits of tolerance and how you understand evil.
So it's not a film that's meant to entertain or even scare you in the typical way.
Not at all. Salò is designed to make you uncomfortable. to make you think, to question, and that's exactly what led to all the condemnation and censorship.
You said it's based on the Marquis de Sade's work. Is that part of what makes it so controversial?
Absolutely. Desade's writing is notorious. It explores things like extreme sexuality, violence, and these philosophical ideas that a lot of people find repulsive. Salo takes those themes and puts them on screen, makes them even more visceral and disturbing.
It's definitely not for everyone. Actually, sounds like a film most people would choose to skip.
Probably right. But for those willing to engage with it, Salo can't be ignored. It's challenging, thought-provoking, and let's be honest, unforgettable.
All right, we've covered films banned for graphic violence, for hitting cultural nerves, and even for political reasons. Now, let's talk about one that got banned because of its religious content. The Last Temptation of Christ. This one caused quite a stir back in the day.
The Last Temptation of Christ. It's a Martin Scorsese film.
Hmm.
And, he's a director known for pushing those boundaries. What made this one so controversial was its portrayal of Jesus. Showed him as a human, struggling with doubts, temptation, even his own mortality.
I remember all the protests about this movie. Some people thought showing Jesus that way was straight up blasphemy.
Right. The idea of Jesus having those human weaknesses and desires, it was deeply offensive to a lot of Christians, disrespectful to their faith.
This was based on a novel, right? Scorsese wasn't just making things up.
Nope. The film's based on a novel by Nikos Kazantzakis. And it's important to remember, Scorsese is a devout Catholic himself. His goal wasn't to mock Christianity. He wanted to explore faith, the human condition, through the lens of Jesus.
So more about exploring the human side of a divine figure.
Exactly. For some, it was a powerful, moving look at faith. But for others, it was an attack on what they believed. Led to boycotts, protests, even bans in some countries.
It's amazing how a film can get such different reactions based on people's own beliefs, their interpretations.
Highlights the power of religious themes in art, and how controversial it can be when those themes are explored in ways that are different or challenging.
Okay, let's shift gears again. Talk about a film that stirred things up for its portrayal of sexuality and gender identity. Brokeback Mountain. In a lot of ways, this film was ahead of its time.
Brokeback Mountain. It's the story of this forbidden love between two cowboys in the American West. Beautiful, heartbreaking film, explores love, loss, and those societal pressures that can really hold back our true selves.
Yeah, I remember how groundbreaking this was, portraying a gay relationship with such sensitivity and realism. But it wasn't embraced by everyone.
No, it wasn't. Brokeback Mountain got critical acclaim, won awards, but it also faced some serious backlash and censorship around the world.
Where was it banned?
Several countries, including China and a lot of countries in the Middle East. It was criticized by conservative groups in the U.S., too. The main issue, the film's core theme, a love story between two men.
It reminds us that even today, LGBTQ plus representation in media can still face resistance and censorship, even in a film as celebrated as Brokeback Mountain.
It does. Highlights the importance of pushing for more acceptance and understanding of different sexual orientations and gender identities. Brokeback Mountain, even with the controversy, helped make way for more inclusive storytelling in cinema.
Powerful example of how film can challenge those social norms and spark important conversations about issues some people would rather just ignore.
Absolutely. Shows that even a film about love and heartbreak can be a lightning rod for controversy if it dares to challenge deeply held prejudices.
Okay, you mentioned earlier how some films were banned for showing real-life events in a controversial way. Any particular film come to mind?
Yeah, the Battle of Algiers is a prime example. It depicts the Algerian War of Independence against France, a really intense and violent period.
So it's a historical war film, but why would it be banned? What made it so controversial?
The Battle of Algiers is known for its realism, and it's unflinching in showing the brutality of war.
Yeah.
It doesn't shy away from either side of the conflict, and it doesn't give you easy answers or clear-cut heroes and villains.
Sounds like it's trying to capture how complex a real historical event is, not just tell a simple good versus evil story.
Right, and that's exactly what made it so controversial. It was banned in France for 5 years after its release, all because of how sensitive and politically charged the subject matter was.
So even though it was a historical film, it was still too sensitive for French audiences at the time.
Yes, the Algerian War was traumatic, divisive. The film brought all those old wounds back to the surface, sparked debate about colonialism, terrorism, the ethics of revolution.
Fascinating how a film, even one based on real events, could be seen as such a threat.
It speaks to the power of cinema,
Mm.
to stir up those emotions, challenge the narrative, make us confront uncomfortable truths about our past.
Now let's switch to a film that got attention not for violence or a political message, but for showing drug use. Reefer Madness. This one's a bit of a cult classic, known for being over the top, often unintentionally hilarious in how it shows the dangers of marijuana.
Reefer Madness. It's a great example of a film that was meant as propaganda, but now it's a cultural artifact, something we look at with amusement and disbelief.
Hard to imagine anyone taking it seriously today. But it was made when there was so much fear and misinformation about marijuana.
Exactly. Reefer Madness was funded by a church group. It was supposed to be this anti-drug morality tale. Shows marijuana use as leading to addiction, insanity, promiscuity, violence, you name it.
So full of those classic scare tactics we associate with anti-drug campaigns.
Oh yeah, full of them. The film's full of exaggerated, inaccurate stuff about the drug's effects, people going crazy after a single puff, committing violent crimes, acting recklessly. It's also overblown.
But back then, people bought into that kind of propaganda, right?
They did. Reefer Madness reflects those social anxieties, those moral panics about drugs back in the 30s. The film's claims have been totally debunked. But it's still a fascinating piece of history.
It's a good reminder of how propaganda and misinformation can shape public opinion, influence policies, even when it's all completely unfounded.
It shows how our views on drug use have changed, too.
Yeah.
What was seen as dangerous and addictive is now, well, in many places, becoming more accepted, even legalized.
Speaking of films meant to get a reaction, we got to talk about Cannibal Holocaust. This one is notorious. Extreme content, controversy surrounding its production. The whole thing.
Cannibal Holocaust. It's considered one of the most banned films ever, and for good reason. It depicts extreme violence and cruelty, including real animal killings, presented as part of the story.
Wait, real? They weren't simulated.
No, they were real. And that's a huge reason the film is still so controversial. Using real animal deaths in a film, pretty much universally condemned.
I get it. Seems like a line no one should cross no matter how realistic you're trying to be.
And it's not just the animal cruelty in Cannibal Holocaust that's so disturbing. There's also the extreme violence and gore involving the human characters. It's so realistic, a lot of people thought they were watching actual murders.
It's one thing to create a fictional horror world. It's another to blur that line between fiction and reality, especially in such a disturbing way.
Cannibal Holocaust is still debated and analyzed. Some say it's this powerful message against human cruelty. Others say it's exploitative, morally wrong. It really makes you think about the limits of art, filmmaking ethics, and our own capacity for violence.
Okay, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's talk about a film that caused an international incident. Became a major news story, The Innocence of Muslims. This wasn't a typical horror film, but it definitely had some horrifying real-world effects.
The Innocence of Muslims, low-budget amateur film. It was made to, well, basically denigrate Islam and the Prophet Muhammad.
I remember this. Sparked violent protests and riots all over.
It did. When it was released, it caused outrage and condemnation across the Muslim world. Governments, religious leaders, international organizations, they all denounced it.
It just shows how fast misinformation and prejudice can spread, especially in our connected world. Images and words can have a huge impact, even when they come from obscure places.
And it raises some tough questions about free speech, religious sensitivities, and the responsibility we all have to think about the consequences of our actions, even in creative expression.
We've covered a lot in this part of our deep dive. Films banned for extreme gore. Films that sparked international incidents. We've seen how horror can reflect those deepest fears, anxieties, and prejudices. But we're not done yet. Stick around for the final part of our exploration. We'll dig into even more banned films that have challenged boundaries, sparked controversy, and left their mark on the world of cinema. All right, welcome back for the final part of our banned horror film deep dive. So far, we've looked at gore, cultural anxieties, political clashes, even historical trauma on film. But there's one more category of banned films we need to get into.
I think you're talking about those films that are just so deeply disturbing, so morally challenging, that they cross a line even seasoned horror fans might struggle with.
Exactly. These are the films that make us question the whole idea of art, the limits of free speech, and how cinema can exploit, traumatize, even incite violence.
The kind of films that make you think, Not just what am I willing to watch, but what should I watch?
Right. So let's get into this ethically murky territory. I think a good starting point is a film that became like the poster child for those video nasties in the UK. A Serbian film. This one has such a reputation for controversy.
Yeah, a Serbian film is definitely designed to shock, to provoke. It pushes those boundaries of what's considered acceptable. It dives into some really heavy stuff, sexual violence, exploitation, depravity, and it's often graphic and disturbing.
Even hardcore horror fans seem to approach this one with caution. What sets a Serbian film apart, even compared to other video nasties?
It's not just about how much violence there is, it's the type of violence. The film gets into some taboo subjects like child abuse and necrophilia and the way it's presented. Many viewers found it just deeply unsettling and exploitative.
So it's not just the gore, but the violation of some very serious moral boundaries.
Exactly. And what makes a Serbian film even more disturbing is that the director insists it's not just about shock value. He says it's a metaphor for the corruption he sees in Serbia, the political and social corruption.
So he's trying to make a statement about his country through this extreme, disturbing lens.
That's what he says, yes. But a lot of people feel like the graphic content just overshadows any message, any artistic merit. Like it becomes transgression just for the sake of it. That's why it's been so condemned and censored.
It sounds like a film that raises some really big questions
Hmm.
about the artist's responsibility, the role of the viewer, and how much we should tolerate in the name of art.
Definitely. A Serbian film makes you confront uncomfortable truths about humanity, about the darkness inside us. And it shows the power of cinema to tap into those dark places.
Okay, let's shift from the bleak world of a Serbian film to a film that caused a very different kind of controversy, one that sparked outrage not for what it showed, but just for existing. The Bunny Game.
The Bunny Game. That's a low-budget independent film, notorious for its graphic depiction of sexual violence and sadism. It tells the story of a prostitute who's kidnapped and tortured. Horribly.
The UK's reaction to this one was interesting. They didn't just ban it, they refused to even give it a rating. That's unusual, right?
It is. The British Board of Film Classification, they're in charge of rating films, basically said the Bunny Game was so extreme, so lacking in any redeeming value, they couldn't even categorize it. They felt its only purpose was to show suffering and degradation. It had no place being seen by the public.
So it wasn't just about protecting viewers from something offensive. They were making a statement about the film itself, saying it had no value.
Right. Refusing to classify the Bunny Game was their way of saying this film was just beyond the pale. Even with the UK's relatively liberal approach to film censorship, they couldn't accept it.
It's interesting to compare that to how they dealt with The Human Centipede 2, which was also very disturbing, but was eventually released with some cuts.
The difference probably comes down to what they saw as the filmmaker's intention. With The Human Centipede 2, they probably felt the director was going for shock value, pushing boundaries, but still working within the horror genre. But the Bunny Games seemed to be only focused on showing suffering. No artistic or thematic reason for it.
So it's not just about what's in the film, but the context, the intent, the message behind it.
Exactly. And that's what makes these banned films so interesting to talk about. It's not a simple black and white issue. It's about understanding all those cultural values, artistic expression, and the potential for something to be harmful.
It forces us to look at our own biases, our own limits, and really think about what we think art is and what it should be.
It does. And it's a conversation worth having, even if it's a little uncomfortable sometimes.
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into banned horror films. We've seen the extremes of gore, the anxieties behind censorship, the clashes between art and morality, and how powerful film can be, both in reflecting and shaping our views of the world.
And even though these films can be disturbing, we've seen how they spark those conversations about free expression, tolerance, and the responsibility that comes with telling stories.
So for our listeners out there, what should they take away from all this? What should they be thinking about?
I think the key is to watch these films with a critical eye, knowing the context of when they were made and why they were banned, and to really talk about the issues they raise.
And remember, even those most extreme, disturbing films, they can teach us something about ourselves, about our society, and about how art can challenge us, provoke us, and inspire us. So until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those brain cells working.